Japanimation Station.
'Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we are shifting into the second phase of the Ufotable Moon works because we are done talking about Card no Kyokai / the Garden of Sinners. And it is time, Jonathan, to talk about what the fuck is the Fate series, and also to talk about the first episode of Fate Zero, which you have now watched.
Indeed. So Sean today is going to introduce us to the world of Fate Stay Night. So if you maybe are someone who, like me, wanted to get into it but wasn't sure where to start, Sean will tell you all about it. And then we will begin our journey with the first anime we're talking about, Fate Zero. And we are talking about just episode 1 today. It's a double-length, big premiere, almost like a short movie or something. Literally has Ufotable's like movie opening that they usually do at the start of it. And it's really good. And Sean, just for you, because I knew you were so excited, I specifically even waited and I watched the episode this morning right before we recorded, so it is as fresh as possible, and I am very excited to talk about all things Fate with you on the next couple episodes of this podcast.
Yes, I have been waiting to do a Fate podcast forever. It's a thing I've had an idea to try to do since before we even did Weekly Suit Gundam, partially because I have had this like fascination with the fact that particularly in the West, for the vast majority of fans of the Fate franchise, the way they got into it was through Fate Zero. Because Fate Zero, which is a prequel anime based on a series of light novels, and we'll go into what all that means, that adaptation from Ufotable, obviously one was like one of the first big Ufotable productions that has that style to it. And so it's like it attracted everybody's attention, but it also came out in the early 2010s. And so it was like 2011, 2012, right when Crunchyroll was becoming a normal service, right? Crunchyroll used to be actually like a piracy thing. And this show started coming out when they had transitioned into a normal streaming service. The show also, I don't know if it is still on Netflix, but it was on Netflix for fucking ever. If it's not on there anymore, I do not remember. But it was very accessible to people in the West, and the visual novel was never translated. Obviously, the light novel for Fate Zero also was never translated into English. And so for most people, Fate Zero is how they got into this franchise. And as someone who started by reading a translation of the visual novel for Fate Stay Night years ago, I've always been fascinated by the idea of like, what is that experience like? Because it seems like it would be very different to start with this prequel. And so that is one of the reasons why we're doing this thing of where we're watching the first episode, is because there's no good spot really to split Fate Zero. The first season, second season thing, the first season of Fate Zero ends at this big cliffhanger right before a big battle sequence that's in the middle of the show. That would be a very frustrating spot to stop and try to have a podcast on. But I wanted to catch Jonathan midstream somewhere, and I thought, why not catch him midstream right at the beginning and just see what the fuck is it like just watching that first episode fresh.
It's great. It's outstanding. I mean, it's a great first episode. It's a very clear introduction. I don't feel like I'm missing anything watching this first episode. I feel like I'm at the beginning of a story that I'm excited to see the rest of. And I think you can see right away why this was such a hit around the world, even in places where Fate Stay Night, the visual novel, is not completely inaccessible. You can get an English translation from the fans and put it together. But that at a minimum requires having a PC and the knowledge of how to kind of like patch it together. And then you have to sit at your computer and play it for, 100 hours? How long is that thing?
Not 100. It's like maybe 50 hours. So it's very long. It's not 100.
Right, but a big, long visual novel, do all of that, whereas this is just an anime. Anyone can watch an anime, right? Because this also had a dub and everything and was, like, easy for people to access. And that first episode is an absolute, like, banger. It's just, it moves, it introduces you to a bunch of characters, but it does it with clarity. It has Ufotable's style. It has Yuki Kajiura's music. I feel like I know the general outline of this thing. There were a couple of moments where I felt like something was being prequelized, but I couldn't tell you exactly what, where I'm like, oh, they're talking about a character being born or something, and I'm like, this is probably set up for something else. But that's just my knowledge of that this is a prequel to a big, long work with lots of different moving pieces. On its own, this is a great intro to a series, and if I knew nothing else about Fate Stay Night and its reputation, I would get to the end of this episode and be like, oh, I want to see more, I'm into this.
Well, that's great to hear, because we are going to obviously see a lot more of it.
Yes.
We've got Fate Zero on our plate, we've got Unlimited Blade Works on our plate, and then Heaven's Feel.
I'm committed either way, but I'm glad that I liked it, because that will make the rest of this podcast much more pleasant to do.
Yes, so I'm very excited to get into all of that. Before we get into that, though, let's do our history lesson, because we've touched on a little bit of it when we did our big first episode for Kata no Kyokai. But I want to talk specifically about some of the Fate stuff, because I think it is useful to understand what the visual novel was, some of how it was structured, like where does Fate Zero come from. All that stuff I think is useful information as we get into this project. So let's turn back the clock. We've been in our 2007 to 2013 mode or whatever across Kata no Kyokai, but let's go back to, the early 2000s, 2001 to 2003, when after the release of Tsukihime, Type-Moon, the Dojin group, was, super successful with this big hit new visual novel. Again, keep in mind that we're talking about big hit. We're talking about within a niche market, but within that niche market of Dojin visual novels, like one of the biggest hits ever. And they're super successful. They're getting some of these spin-off stuffs. There's offers to do the anime adaptation, all that's going on. And they decide, well, let's make our next proper visual novel, not a sequel to Tsukihime, because they did a whole little kind of pseudo sequel, what's called a fan disc, which is kind of like a bit of a sequel, but is more kind of like, let's have some fun scenes with the characters and have a good time with it kind of thing. And so Takashi Takeuchi, the artist, recommended to Nasu, our writer, to say, hey, let's take that high school little kind of half novel you wrote that was inspired by some of the stuff of these different shows that were about bringing back like legendary heroes and stuff and having them fight in a modern day setting. Let's bring that back and adapt it into a visual novel. And so they started working on that and sort of fleshing out that story and figuring out how do you take this and turn it into a visual novel. One of the key things that Takashi Takeuchi recommended early in that process was that they gender swap the two main characters, which is a thing that becomes very important when we talk about Saber. When we get to that with like Fate Zero and everything, we see Saber very briefly right at the end of Fate Zero, our quote-unquote King Arthur. And so there's a gender swap that happens with these characters that's very important, that serves the backbone of what then becomes Fate Stay Night. And so they're working on that project, and it becomes clear very early on in the process that this is a much, much, much bigger project than what Tsukihime was. And so they realize that they have reached the limit of what you can do in a Dojin context, and they need some full cold hard fucking cash, right? They need money in order to make this thing. They need other people that they can hire. So that's when they found the company called Notes, which is technically like the parent company that manages the Type-Moon brand. And so Fate Stay Night starts becoming not a fan project effectively, but like an official game made by a company. One interesting detail about that process is that during the production of Fate Stay Night, there was a period where Nasu became ill and it was difficult for him to work on the game. When that was happening, they were throwing around ideas about bringing in guest writers to write like little interludes or extra little bits of the game, since they couldn't continue with the main scenario until Nasu got better. One of the people that came up in that conversation was a big writer in the visual novel scene who worked at a company called Nitro Plus named Urobuchi Gen, who also came out of the doujin scene. And they're like, let's bring this guy again. And he's like, they knew him from the doujin scene. It's like some of his visual novels, like Saya no Uta, within that little kind of like doujin, like kind of hardcore, like Saya no Uta is a pretty intense thing. Like, let's like bring him in. He's got this dark style, is really cool. His projects are really successful. We like what he does. He's a big fan of Tsukihime, and they started to try to bring him in and do that. And it ultimately fell apart because they realized, basically like the quote I found was incredibly funny, where they said like, oh, we realized we are a company now and you can't just like have your buddy come over on the weekend and work on your game. Like, there are labor laws now. Like, you have to, like, that dude needs to be hired. You have to write up a fucking contract. So it's like, it's not your little fan project thing. You can't just do that. So ultimately that plan fell through, but put a pin in that because that idea becomes very important later. But then obviously eventually they finished the visual novel. It actually ends up being a delayed a full year. It was supposed to come out winter 2003. It ends up coming out, or it was supposed to come out January 2003. It ends up coming out January 30th, 2004 in Japan. It is a massive, massive hit within its market. It sells 150,000 plus copies in the first year of release, which I know in most contexts that doesn't sound like a lot. In this context, that is a lot. One thing that's really important to keep in mind with Fate Stay Night, it is technically what is called an eroge, or an erotic video game. It has pornographic, like, full sex scenes in it. Like, not a lot. It's a very small portion of the overall content of the game, but part of, like, that market, particularly at the time, was that it was pretty necessary to include something like that in order for your thing to, like, thrive in that market. It was what everyone was doing. It brought attention to your project. And so they did the same thing with Tsukihime. It wasn't like the goal. It's not like, if you want to find porn or whatever to get off to, that is not a good place to go. It's a very tiny part of it.
I love the idea of someone going through just dozens of hours of Fate Stay Night.
Yes.
Like, when do I get off?
Yeah.
God damn it.
To like the 4 sex scenes that exist across the 3 routes in like a 50-hour thing. But it is there. And so it's like, it is a part, and it'll be something when we get to the adaptations, we'll talk about how do they deal with it, because the TV show and the movies deal with it in different ways, partially because the movies are movies, so they don't have to air on TV, also because the storyline they're dealing with is different, and like how good and important them being actual like sex scenes are versus the like all ages version of those scenes is different depending on which story you're talking about. The first storyline has the dumbest sex scenes imaginable. They're terrible. The second storyline, it's a pretty decent scene, but doesn't really have to be a full sex scene. The third storyline, Heaven's Feel, I would argue, clearly the movies felt the same way. The sex scenes are actually really important to the way that story works. But anyways, again, so when we're talking about a big success like 150,000 copies, like, you're talking about a very niche market when this is still an eroge or an erotic video game. Something that's really peculiar about Fate Stay Night, at least in my experience. I'm not an expert on visual novels, but I've played a few over the years, and I've never played anything that is structured exactly the way that Fate Stay Night is. We've kind of hinted at it a little bit in earlier discussions, but it's really important to understanding why there are these like different adaptations. What is it to be Unlimited Blade Works versus Heaven's Feel? Most visual novels are structured like they have a shared prologue period of time where you're going on like the sort of like or beginning of the story where there's going to be some choices usually associated with like different characters that then eventually you make enough character choices that then when it branches out at the end of the prologue section, it will branch out into, say, if there's like 5 heroines or whatever, and it's like a dating sim game. There will be 5 different routes for each of the different heroines. Based on your choices of the prologue, it will filter you into one of those 5 routes. If you start the game, for most visual novels, anyone starting the game for the first time, they could pick whichever character they're most interested in and get filtered into those routes. And so it's like kind of 5 different stories that all start from the same basic premise. That's most visual novels. Fate Stay Night's pretty different. Fate Stay Night, honestly, I would struggle to even really describe as a video game or in video game terms because it doesn't really have a branching storyline. I don't think you'd consider this a branching storyline because the only choices you make that matter are ones that lead you to bad endings, right? Like sometimes your character's in a fight and there are like 2 choices presented to you. One of the choices is the right choice and will continue along the story on its normal path. One of the choices is the wrong choice, and if you pick that one, you will get a scene where your characters are like murdered by the enemy or something bad happens and the story can't go forward, and you get put back to the point where the choice is made and you pick the other choice. But that's it. There aren't actually branching paths, not like that example I said where you have this prologue and then it branches out to those different points and you could pick them whenever you play the game. Fate Stay Night has like what I would almost describe as like overlapping scenarios. What it more is you have 3 different storylines that you do all start technically from the same premise, but those 3 storylines must be played in that exact order. There is Route 1, the Fate route, which is based around the character Saber, and it's like for her. There's once you complete that route, you then, upon starting a new game, are given a choice very early on that branches you out into this new path that's now available to you. That is the second route, Unlimited Blade Works, which is around the character Tosaka Rin. And then once you complete that route to completion, you then start the game again from the beginning, get presented a new choice very early on. That filters you down to the third and final route, Heaven's Feel, that's based around the character Sakura. But every time you play the game fresh, you must play the stories in that order, and the stories are written such that it is understood that that is how the player plays them, so that each one is both a kind of like what if scenario of like what if the story went this way from a similar premise, but they are also effectively sequels to the previous stories in a thematic sense, because each subsequent story becomes more complicated and develops the ideas of the previous one. And so all the storylines thematically are in conversation with one another. This is one of the things that makes it a complicated thing to adapt, because really, Fate Stay Night as a project is like, you can't take Unlimited Blade Works truly in isolation. It's incomplete on its own as a story. Similarly, Heaven's Feel, if you watch the Heaven's Feel movies or you play the Heaven's Feel route without knowing anything from the previous routes, you would be completely fucking lost, because it's written, understood that the audience will know who these characters are, they will know the world building, they'll know the concepts, and they will have processed the thematic ideas of the 2 previous routes that then serve the backbone of this much more complex and kind of like provocative story that the third story is. And so that's one of the things that is very, like, I think thorny about Fate Stay Night as a material to be adapted. It's also one of the things that makes it an incredibly engaging visual novel, and to me, like an incredible work of literature. I don't really think of Fate Stay Night as a video game. I really think like would emphasize the novel part of the visual novel for Fate Stay Night, because it is truly like a novel that is enhanced by visuals, voice acting, and music to like produce a slightly different effect. It's interactive fiction, but it is not a video game in a more traditional sense, or a video game in the way that other visual novels are that have more active branching paths, or might have puzzle sequences or stuff like that. Fate Stay Night doesn't really have anything like that. It truly is, you are reading a book and you have a very prescribed order in which you must read through all 3 of those scenarios.
And this is not the only time Kinoko Nasu has done this, because Witch on the Holy Night, Mahotsukai no Yoru, is, I think, in my understanding, even more linear. I've played about 5 hours of it so far and have not encountered any interactivity other than advancing text. Yeah. It is just, and I know there's no branching paths or anything. It very much is a illustrated novel. And that one makes sense because he wrote it as a novel before it ever had a video game component. But yeah, he is, it seems like novel is definitely the operative term here.
Yeah, and it is, and fun things that's interesting though is that there are plenty of like those kinds of visual novels that are truly like there's effectively almost no or actually no choices, and it's just the visual novel format. But it's like I have yet to encounter a visual novel that is actually structured the exact way Fate Stay Night is, where it does have multiple routes, but you don't get to pick those routes. It's not a choice thing. It is just like, it's taking the narrative idea of multiple routes or of branching paths, but it's not actually taking the mechanical idea of branching paths. And it's a very interesting structure. It is also one of the things that makes Fate Stay Night incredibly long, because it is like basically a game and its 2 sequels is almost a way to think about it in a weird way. So that's sort of what Fate Stay Night is as a game / as a visual novel. Again, it's super popular. 2 years after its release, it gets an animated adaptation by Studio Dean. We are not covering that animated adaptation because it's not Ufotable. It doesn't have the best reputation. I've never seen it all the way through because I didn't like it that much, the little bit of it that I did see. But it is an adaptation, broadly speaking, of the first route of Fate Stay Night. So if people like really don't want to play the game at all, but they want to know some of what that first route is, you can technically watch that Studio Dean one. Again, we're not going to cover it. I think one thing that's nice is that a lot of the basic ideas of the first route, the Fate route, are kind of covered by Fate Zero, because Fate Zero has a lot of stuff involving Saber and sets up her character well enough that I don't think you really need to actually get the Fate route. I think the Fate Zero anime in this version kind of replaces that a little bit, and then you get Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel, and I think that works well enough. But there is that original anime adaptation in 2006. The thing that's kind of most important about that adaptation for us is that is where all the voice casting happens. So the voice cast for that 2006 show, they then come back in 2007 for what is the best-selling version of this game, Rialta Nua, which that came out on PlayStation 2. That is the all-ages version. That is where they said, we now are big enough, we can sell this to a mass market, we don't need the sex scenes to help sell our game. They replaced the sex scenes with all ages equivalents. You will see the all age version of the scene in Unlimited Blade Works. That is what is adapted in that version. And it will be very obvious when you get to it, like, oh, you could see how in another context this could have been written as a sex scene. But you have that all ages version. That version is also fully voice acted, so the cast came in for that one, and that's like kind of what cements them as the voice cast. They are the voice cast. I don't even think there are any like recast, certainly not amongst any of the main characters across the whole series. So it's like that 2006 show, regardless of like maybe its quality as an adaptation or in terms of its animation, that is certainly not UFO table level. At least the voice casting director did a damn good fucking job on that thing, because it's a really good cast. So that 2007 version comes out, Rialta Nua. Around that time, a little bit before that, is also where you start getting the Fate Zero thing coming up. So Fate Zero is a series of light novels that are written by Urobuchi Gen. So remember that pin we put in the, like, hey, they thought about bringing in guest writers. Well, what ultimately came out of that is, after Fate Stay Night came out, they're like, well, there's more we can do. We're like working with different companies on spin-offs. Like there were like fighting game adaptations being made and stuff like that. They were in talks about doing the anime thing. Like, well, what else could we do with the franchise? Well, the structure of Fate Stay Night is, in terms of like the setting, is that you have this, like, every 80 years or whatever, there's that Holy Grail war that happens. And then you have the fourth Holy Grail war, which a bunch of crazy shit happens in that. That is what sets up the fifth Holy Grail war, which only happens 10 years later. The fifth Holy Grail war is is when Fate Stay Night is set. But that fourth Holy Grail war is super important to the story. There are lots of the major characters and events of that are discussed in great detail over the course of Fate Stay Night. And it's a clear area to like go in and actually fully dramatize it, flesh out who would be all of the characters involved in that. How do we like really dig into the meat of this? And like, who is someone that we could get to work on that project? And they're like, let's fucking get Urobuchi Gen. Partially because Fate Zero, by its nature of being a prequel and also being basically all adult characters versus some of the main characters of Fate Stay Night are teenagers in high school, as is kind of typical for most visual novels. It's like this more adult drama version of the story that has a tragic quality because it's a prequel. All prequels are kind of tragic in some way or another. Let's get the dude who's like really well known for writing these kind of darker, more mature stories that also is our buddy because they've met each other at all these cons for years and years and years. And so they call up Urobuchi Gen. He's really interested in working on it. I mean, he had been a fan on Tsukihime, so he had wanted to do the Fate Stay Night thing in the first place. He comes in, he writes it. It actually is originally released as the doujinshi in Comiket in like 2005. So actually the dates on the English Wikipedia page are slightly off because it started being published originally in 2005 as a doujinshi. It then gets picked up by an official publisher in 2006. And so the full run of the light novels for Fate Zero is 4 volumes from 2006 to 2007, detailing the events of the Fourth Holy Grail War that sets up what is going to happen in Fate Stay Night. And then that is when our good friends Ufotable come in. After 2009, they have finished their adaptation of the original set of stories for Kata no Kyokai, but they want to keep on working with Type-Moon. The Type-Moon Ufotable collaboration has been incredibly fruitful, and it's like, well, what is something we can work on? It wouldn't make sense to do a new adaptation of the Fate route for Fate Stay Night. That was like only 3 years old at that point. I don't think they wanted to move on to Unlimited Blade Works. Studio Dean actually did a movie version of Unlimited Blade Works, which I have no idea how the fuck that happens because the TV version is 24 episodes and they cut a lot of shit out. I don't know what one movie is, but that movie exists out there. I am curious about it. I've never actually watched it. But so like the Fate Stay Night stuff is kind of already handled to a certain extent. So the clear thing for Ufotable to work on is, well, we've got these visual novels. Urobuchi Gen is hot shit. The year that Fate Zero starts coming out, 2011, that is also the year that Madoka Magica comes out. If you want to know what Urobuchi Gen did, that is one of the biggest things he did. He did Madoka Magica. He then did like Psychopath. So it's like around the time that Fate Zero starts coming out, Urobuchi Gen starts putting out some of the best anime, or like writing some of the best anime of the early 2010s, including obviously Fate Zero, which he was involved in. And so they go in, they do the Fate Zero thing, and then the rest is history, right? It is hugely, massively popular, expands the popularity of the franchise even more. It attracts a bunch of people, and then it starts coming out over here, and then it starts becoming a big hit over here as well, and expanding the fan base over here, because again, Fate had never been released over here in official capacity whatsoever. And so that's kind of what brings us to this point where Fate Zero is out. We have both watched the first episode. The series is directed by, I do want to note this, Aoki A, who, like, very notably for us, we saw his work that he was the director of the first movie of Kara no Kyokai. So obviously he had worked on all the other movies as well, but he was the main director for that first film. He's also gone on to do a bunch of other really good things like the show Recreators, and stuff like that. But he is the director specifically for Fate Zero. Kazuya Yuki gets to come back to do the music and all that stuff. The writers for Fate Zero are all writers who worked on the movies. So it's like all the people who are doing the Kara no Kyokai movies, they're the people who then move on to do this TV show.
Well, this is indeed complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to this, but it's fascinating. And I will say, for those interested in the visual novel, I have not read it yet, specifically under Sean's instructions not to for the experiment of this season of Japanimation Station.
Yes.
Just to go with the anime. But I did install it on my PC just to see how easy it is, and it is easier than ever now. I literally found a fan site that was like, download this, unzip it, it's done. And it's like people have made like an ultimate edition that is Rialto Nua, but with the sex scenes put back in, all translated into English, blah, blah, blah. Very easy to find. So if you're interested, it's easier than ever. Just not official, but, you know, maybe hopefully one day. We do have this translation of Witch on the Holy Night now, so who knows? Maybe we'll eventually get official ports. That would be cool. But for now, it is out there if you want it. But we are talking specifically about Fate Zero, and yeah, I watched the first episode this morning. It is a big... Ufotable, we know, likes to do their 45-minute season premieres. They did it for Kimetsu Season 2, where they're doing it for Kimetsu Season 3, which is going to start airing very soon from when this episode comes out. And we have that here as well. And it's very striking. So I really knew nothing about Fate Stay Night before this season, Sean. I knew it was a popular visual novel. I knew it had these three roots because there were all the adaptations and stuff, but I didn't know what it was about. I had literally no idea. Mm-hmm. You, I think, saying Holy Grail War was like, oh, okay. Well, I don't know what that is, but that's what it's about, I guess. And so going into this was kind of like, so I knew that. I knew some of the characters I'd seen around, like certainly Saber, who I did not know her name until watching this episode, but Saber's like character design. If you have been a fan of anime in the last 10 years, you have seen Saber, right?
Yeah, she is the big iconic character from Fate that, is on all the marketing material and stuff, yeah.
So I was literally like waiting, but I didn't even know the whole thing about like the summons versus the mages and all of that. So I was like watching this episode like, when does that chick in the armor show up, basically, right? Because it's like, all I know is Saber. It would be like watching Dragon Ball. You know Goku, but you don't know anything else, right? And so I was kind of waiting for her to show up and then, of course, find out that she's the one who's summoned by Excalibur and all of that at the end of the episode. But yeah, I really liked this. It's such an interesting premise. The whole idea of this is the fourth Holy Grail War. It has been this thing kind of set up to like make the war between mages slightly more sane over the years. Even though this is a prequel, this is not actually the 0th point. There is earlier story still, because this is the fourth war. But you start 10 years before the war begins with your first scene with Emiya Kiritsugu, and then you have you kind of go up over the years up until the present, and you see all the different people. And one thing that came to mind is you talking about in one of the Kara no Kyokai episodes how all the mages in the Kinoko Nasu verse are giant pieces of shit. And of course, you start to see that here because it is a den of goddamn vipers doing horrible things and a couple of decent people, it seems like, in the mix. And I am excited to watch all of these giant personalities, sometimes with Gundam caliber names, I have to say, bouncing off each other.
like Kenneth El Meloy Archibald.
Or Waver Velvet. Waver Velvet is the most... That is like the person who is like in the other Gundam, this like sidekick character like Job John or something is Waver Velvet. I love that. Yeah, no, the names are fantastic.
Yes, the names are absolutely fantastic. And yeah, so I think the thing that's like interesting for me with like this first episode of Fate Zero is that Fate Stay Night is like so meticulous with how it sets up its world building in the visual novel. Like, because it's got, as you will see when we do Unlimited Blade Works, it has 2 prologues effectively. And it also has a main character in Fate Stay Night who is someone who is not he's not really a part of that world. He gets dragged into that world, right? He's an audience surrogate to a certain extent. Like, he's more a part of that world than maybe it like comes on at first, but he's not, kind of in a Koto-esque way, right? It's like he's not really a part of that world, but he's still fucking weird. It's that kind of Nasu character, but he serves as an effective audience surrogate. Fate Zero is an interesting starting point because it does not have an audience surrogate character. All of the characters are part of all of this bullshit. Like there's nobody in here that isn't either a mage or someone in close proximity to the world of magic who has to have this stuff be explained to them. They still obviously have scenes of characters getting explained to them, but it's very much in a, as you know, da-da-da-da-da-da kind of way, because this is all stuff that all these people know. And so it's interesting watching Fate Zero and seeing them having to try to find ways to get some of these concepts explained so that the audience can understand it, while also not having any character who's truly a fresh audience surrogate. You have like kind of, Waver only knows one piece of it. He doesn't know much about the Holy Grail War, so he's like useful because it's a lot of that stuff's new to him. Like Kide, the priest guy, is like not fully in that world, so they get to kind of explain a bit to him. But it's interesting seeing them have to juggle how do we get the exposition across while also, making it an entertaining story that is like building up to this big moment of them summoning most of the heroic spirits that are going to be used in the war.
Well, what's funny is I hadn't even thought of it in that way because, I mean, obviously I don't know what I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what I'm missing, and surely there's stuff I don't understand yet. But this first episode, it's 45 minutes, it's a double-length anime episode, and it is, the first thing that's striking is in comparison to Kara no Kyokai, and in comparison to like what I've read of like Witch on the Holy Night and some other little things of Kinoko Nasu I've seen, this is extraordinarily propulsive. Like, yes. Versus Kara no Kyokai is intentionally slow, and it is like not misleading, but it is like off-putting, and it like, it intentionally keeps you sort of confused or off kilter in certain ways. This is not like that at all. This is very much, we're going to hit the ground running this episode just gets off like a fucking bullet and is jumping around and introducing you to things. But I never felt it was unclear. Like, I think it manages to be very clear, and I think it's because of how well sort of edited and put together the story is here, of going between all these different locations and characters, and that tapestry effect in and of itself actually does most of the exposition for you, of showing all of these people working towards different goals through the same means, which is this Holy Grail War. I actually think the point where the story starts, which is you're 8 years ago in Germany, and you have Emiya and you have his wife, Iris Viel von Eisenborn. Yes. Great names. But anyway, they have their daughter who is born. And you have that first scene where Emiya's are kind of brooding. It seems to me like roughly the hero of the series so far. And he's kind of our brooding hero and says he's worried, this is going to lead to their deaths. But he has this wish that is like important enough, and we see she believes in it too, so she's willing to risk her life. And that is such a good kind of like starting point. And then we kick off into everything else. Like, that's the slowest scene in this. Other than that, it's like very propulsive. And I think it introduces us to this idea that something big is on the line. There's this mystical artifact that will grant them a wish, and they are willing to kind of risk everything, and this person feels like a little bit of an outsider to it. And then we're kind of off to the races and seeing all of these people and seeing the structure of the mages, and that they are mostly pieces of shit, and that maybe there's a good reason why there's someone like Emiya, who is known as a mage assassin, is coming into the realm of things. And we go through that, and we see some people in it, purely for their own ends. We see other characters. There's the one, Kariyamato, who is the one who puts himself in the den of the fucking worms to try to save the daughter of this friend. And we see all of these. We see Waver Velvet, who is a kid who seemingly should be more sympathetic, but then we see he's also kind of just as vain as the rest of them, and might be a serial killer.
Well, I love he steals Cadith's like magic fucking artifact or whatever, fucks off to Japan, goes in, like uses magic to convince this old couple that he is their grandson visiting on like a visit or whatever. And he has also stolen some roosters that he sacrifices for his ritual.
So he's doing some bad stuff. So you have all of that, and then we kind of come back around. Well, we see Kiritsugu a couple of times through the episode, but we come back around and end on them when they summon Saber. All the people are summoned, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's a very propulsive first episode. Like I said, I don't know what I don't know, and I'm sure there's things I'm missing. And certainly they're probably setting up characters that will be big in other ways later on. But I feel like you get the stakes of it pretty quickly, and I am impressed because it is such a high concept premise.
Yeah.
You've got the Holy Grail, you've got a battle royale kind of style war going on, you've got these mages, you've got these summons of heroes from the past, you're mixing in like Christian mythology via the Holy Grail, and like you've got this Christian sect with people with crosses around their necks, but you've also got all of this like sort of like Western and some Eastern like mythology going on here with like Arthur Pendragon and all of that, and then all in this sort of small Japanese town is where it's going to go down. Extraordinarily high concept, but I think this is a very confident first episode in the way that Ufotable Productions tend to be extremely confident pieces of storytelling.
Yeah, because it is like, to me, it's like a huge feat of what they accomplish in this first episode, because it is like, there's so much stuff going on. As you say, it's a very high concept premise because it's like, it's pretty unique. Not to say that there are no stories that predate Fate, like that resemble it in any ways. Like obviously it has its inspirations, but there's a lot of stuff going on to like sort of set up the concepts happening here. It's not a simple like, oh, this is sort of like a Star Wars-y thing, or oh, it's sort of like a Lord of the Rings-y thing. It's a pretty unique sort of fantasy like construct that's being introduced to you here. But yes, it is heartening to hear that you feel that, because again, it's hard for me to tell because I know all this stuff already. So it's hard for me to tell how effective is it at introducing it. I can obviously assume that it's good because a lot of people get into the series this way, but it's good to hear from you that yes, like it is very effective through that editing, through jumping around the POVs and giving you this ensemble cast. Because while Kiritsugu is like, if I had to identify the main guy, Kiritsugu would be the main guy, but it is effectively an ensemble, right? It's got a huge cast of characters that is jumping around and showing us this, that is able to give you the general sense of what is going on here.
I think looking through the history, this looks like this is the first time Ufotable did an hour-long premiere for a show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it makes sense. How the fuck would you have done the 25-minute premiere of this?
Yes.
Like, you would have had to like do it as more of a prologue and like pick one character and kind of stick on them, I think. But then it depends on who you pick. It's like, what if you pick the one who would make sense there, honestly, is probably Mato, but it's so dark and like sad. That would be such a fucked up first episode to do. But because they have an hour, they're able to do it all, and you get a little bit of everything, and that's good.
Yeah. It is a very, as you say, very propulsive first episode. So I just want to hear from you, Jonathan. What is your understanding of like the Holy Grail War and how it works based on this first episode?
I mean, my understanding is that so in this world, the Holy Grail is an actual, like, not just artifact, but thing with some kind of, like, will of its own. It is a mystical object that it grants a single wish, right? And the person can wish for anything. It's sort of like the Dragon Balls if they were just one thing and had a consciousness, and the mages fight for supremacy over this thing. I think it's through Waver Velvet when he's in the library looking stuff up. We get some of the backstory about how there was initially a cadre of mage families. The like three big families tried to do the Grail together, but learned the Grail would only accept one will, and so it created this incredibly bloody conflict. And now this has been sort of normalized into this every 60 years the mages will fight for it. The mages are a very, very hierarchical, supremical society because this is Waver Velvet's whole thing, is that he's a third generation mage, but like the great families are like ninth generation, and he's trying to prove that you don't need to be ninth generation or whatever. And so they fight over the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail has a will of its own because it picks to some degree who will fight in the conflict. So the people who have like the symbols on their hands, right? They're the ones who have been chosen by the Grail, although it clearly can also be manipulated because the Mato family has their parasitic worm dungeon that is one of the most disturbing things I've seen in an anime. It's pretty fucked up, especially when the first person you see in the worm dungeon is like a 5-year-old girl. That's no fun. But anyway, so there's these worms that can, like, I guess, get you the sigil, but they will also take your life, seemingly. So you have all of that. But I like that you get this sense of, Kiritsugu seems like he's one of the earliest ones to get the, like, symbol on his hand, because over the decade that this episode sort of traces, different people are, like, coming into getting the symbol based on sort of, like, their will and their wish. But later in the episode, you have this really dynamite sequence where you're cutting between Kiritsugu and Kodomine and Kirei Kodomine, and like they're two different areas where they're kind of learning about each other from afar with their data, and they have this kind of like begrudging respect for one another because of the knowledge that the Grail chose them. Like Kiritsugu is like, this Kodomine guy scares me because it seems like he believes in nothing, but the Grail did choose him, so he must want something. And I like that idea a lot. So the Grail is pitting these people against each other. It seems like there is probably more going on here than I am aware of so far in terms of these different dynamics, but that is what I understand so far. I'm not sure how they do briefly mention like the actual Christian roots of the Holy Grail. I'm curious if there's any more with that, or if it is the sort of just window dressing kind of thing that we often get with Christianity and anime. But yes, that is what I understand so far.
Yeah, these guys. There's a lot of things in there, right? There's some like details that I'll just.
Is it good for having seen 45 minutes of the Fate world?
It's pretty good. I think one of the key things is what is going on with them summoning people? What is all of that?
Oh, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, they're summoning. Those are the people who like fight in the war, right? Is that they're going to use but the mages have to have like enough sort of like power and strength to actually like summon these beings and be able to like use them effectively. But they need the different relics that they've collected from around the world, and the relics kind of determine who they're going to summon, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and that's they're trying to get the best summons.
So what is the like? Why are we calling this one character Saber? What does that come from?
It's Excalibur, right? Because the scabbard they have is like, I think they name check Excalibur if I'm not mistaken. And so it's like Arthur Pendragon, King Arthur is who they expect to get. And they know the sword is special because of the scabbard, like has not been scratched in like 10,000 years of existence, blah, blah, blah. But it is a surprise when Saber is a woman, right? Because they're expecting King Arthur. I don't know any more past that because that's where the episode ends.
Yes. Okay, so I'll explain like a couple of things here just to like make some of this stuff clear, because there were a few points. So like one thing to make clear, I mean, you had it right with like the three families, but I just want to like point out who the three families are, because they are all involved.
There are a lot of proper nouns in this episode, I will say. If I don't know them all, there's like 50 introduced over the course of this episode.
Yes, again, and like, because a lot of this, like what Fate Zero is compressing in this one episode, obviously, like it will have stuff that it is explaining in later episodes as well. It's not like they abandoned doing exposition or something, but still they are compressing what in the light novel, in the visual novel for Fate Stay Night is maybe like 8 hours or something. Like in that 8 hours is also covering other things that Fate Zero doesn't have to deal with, like its own characters that are only in Fate Stay Night. But still, like it's a long buildup of a lot of exposition. Again, like Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works, the TV show, in adapting pretty faithfully the opening of the visual novel, has 2 45-minute opening episodes because it's adapting both of the prologues that Fate Stay Night has, because it has so much shit to cover as 2 prologues. So there's a lot of compression happening in Fate Zero. So the 3 families are the Tosakas, the Ainsburns, and then the Makiri. But the Maki, this is something they haven't told you yet, but it's something you might as well know. The descendants of the Makiri family are the Matos. So Zokin, the old man with the worms, he is, and his family is one of the descendants of one of the 3 families. The Ainsburns, which is where Kiritsugu is, and he's working for them, that is one of the other families. I don't know if you noticed, but I didn't remember this at all. They name drop Heaven's Feel in this episode. Do. He says Heaven's Feel. Put a pin in that. We will talk about that in fucking weeks from now, but eventually that is going to be important, obviously, because it's the name of one of the arcs.
Answered a question for me that I sort of had is like, is Heaven's Feel a like just artistic name for like the end of the story, or is it a thing in the universe? It's a thing in the universe, I now know.
It is.
There we go.
It is, as he says, it is the third magic heavens field. We will find out what the fuck that means forever from now. And then the third family is the Tosakas, who, of course, we've got them because we have Tokiomi, who's the head of the household. He's the guy who's working with Kire, who takes him in, is like training him, and he has his daughter, Dean, who we will see more of in the future. Notably, there are multiple characters that are children and or babies, and this is a prequel, so probably that will be important in Fate's Day Night. So again, Tosakas, Einsburns, and the Mato/the Makiri family. Those are the three that started it. I think one thing to understand about the Holy Grail War is that it is not a thing that, like, the entire world of mages is super interested in. It is specifically this area. So it's like the clock tower is not like, it's not like it's their whole thing. Again, the clock tower being the school and kind of main association where the mages are involved, right? We heard a lot about it in movie 5 of Kata no Kyokai. All the scenes with Kaneth and Waver at that institution, that is the clock tower. So that is where they're at. Waver's studying at the clock tower to be a mage. So it's like, they're interested in it. It is a notable phenomenon, but there's a lot of crazy shit that's always going on in the world of mages. So like Waver, for instance, not knowing anything about the Holy Grail War and having to study about it and read about it in this book. And he describes it as like this weird ritual happening in the Far East. That's because it is, for an average mage, it's a relatively obscure thing that's happening. So it's like notable to know that it's like, it is not a thing that all the mages are obsessed with. It's very specifically these two Japanese families and then this Russian family, because of course Russia's proximity like incredibly close to Japan, the Einsburns, that are really care about it. And then, so you've got that dynamic going on. The other thing I want to touch on is what is going on with the summons and like Saber and all that. Waver explains this, but I think it goes by pretty quickly. One of the things that is happening with what they are summoning are these people called heroic spirits, which are either mythological / historical figures that kind of conflate the two. Obviously, this is a world where magic exists, so some things that we would consider myth maybe is actually history in the world of Fate. That's not that important. But they are people who are mythological. They have passed into like history and legend as heroes. They exist in the like collective subconscious as heroes, and so they are able to be summoned. All of this doesn't come up in Fate Zero, but it might as well just be interesting to connect it to. It is connected to the idea of the counterforce that we saw in the 5th Kata no Kyokai movie, that like one of the things that the world can do if like things are on the brink of annihilation is the world can put these heroic spirits into play to try to put the world back onto the right path. That is technically why the heroic spirits exist. That's obviously not the purpose they're being used for here, but that's kind of in like the cosmology of the Nasuverse. That is like what they are. And heroic spirits are beings of tremendous magic and tremendous power. They're not a thing that a human normally would ever be able to summon. So the Holy Grail War, like the ritual with the Holy Grail, enables you to summon these heroic spirits that normally you wouldn't be able to, because you're actually borrowing magic from the Grail itself in order to do the summoning. This is something that Kiritsugu tells us, is that most of that ritual is unnecessary. It's just sort of like, a fun little thing to do to feel like you're participating. But really, the Holy Grail is the thing doing the work into summoning these entities into existence, because no normal human would be able to hold enough magical power to actually do that. It's like an insane act. You will see these servants / heroic spirits are incredibly powerful entities. They're like superhuman beings. So they're summoned by the Holy Grail. One thing that allows them to be summoned is that they are not the full version of the heroic spirits. They are summoned into the 7 different classes. And that's where the saber and all that stuff comes from, is you're effectively summoning an aspect of the heroic spirit that is associated with one of the classes, rather than the whole thing that might be too much for even the Holy Grail to summon on a whim. So instead of you summoning King Arthur, you're summoning the saber aspect of King Arthur. The 7 classes are Saber, Lancer, Archer, Rider, Caster, Assassin, and Berserker. And so theoretically, many heroic spirits would be able to have different aspects. King Arthur could potentially be a rider, and he would have like his magical steed or whatever. Or King Arthur had a lance called Rungominiad in many of the myth. And so you could potentially summon him as a lancer and summon that aspect of the heroic spirit. So each of the heroic spirits summoned are summoned into one of those classes. So there are 7 masters summoning 7 heroic spirits, each one filling one of the 7 classes. And then those heroic spirits are then referred to as servants. So you'll hear in this, the English word, right, master and servant. So you hear that terminology a lot. And the masters have their command spells, which is that mark on their hand. And that is what gives them the ability to command and control the servant that they have summoned. They have 3 command spells, and they can use those to compel the servant to do whatever they want. This is stuff you haven't heard yet, but I might as well explain it. They can compel the servant to do whatever command. And so that is what gives them authority. Like if the servant decided, say, fuck this master, I don't want to deal with this shit, you could subjugate that servant somehow by commanding them, like, hey, commit suicide or whatever. It's like, you know, they have the power to control them with one of those 3 spells. But they only have 3, so that'll come up. Obviously, it's an important dynamic that determines the relationship between the master and their summoned servant. So again, a lot of that is like, a lot of that is information that they have technically said, but it comes by very quickly. They do list all the different classes. This is all in the book that like Waver reads out from. But that's like some of those other kind of fiddly details that's going on here.
Yes, I remembered all of that. Now that you're saying it, the stuff about the classes, I guess I didn't understand the exact relationship between the classes and the people, because it does, as you say, go by very fast. And we don't know them yet. We see them briefly at the end of the episode, but we don't like understand these figures as characters, which I assume they actually are.
Yeah, because we've only have sort of named, broadly speaking, 2 of the heroic spirits. We have Saber. Then Kide has already summoned Assassin, who we see. And actually, Assassin refers to himself as Hassan. So we know this is some dude named Hassan. And he is the Assassin class. And actually, there is one, I didn't remember this. One of the masters and servants have not been summoned yet. That actually happens in the next episode in what is going to be, that is a very good scene. But we have not yet seen Castor. He has not come up yet. So we have one more servant left to go.
I'm excited. I'm interested to see this. Because, I was trying to keep count over the course of the episode, because at one point we specifically know we have 5, and the 6th, I think, is Waver Velvet comes in and takes that. And then we're waiting for the 7th, but I wasn't quite sure because there's so many characters, and I hadn't quite done the count in my head. So that does make sense that there's one more to go. But yeah, I will say though, like that's all interesting details to know. I don't feel like I necessarily needed to know all of that explicitly from out of this episode, right?
No.
Because
and again,
it's
a lot of
very
it,
good at...
Yeah, a lot of the second episode is also going to go over a lot of that stuff in more detail also, obviously. But
yeah. No, and I know it's fun to talk about it on the podcast here, but I'm just saying, like, that's how I didn't feel confused at the end of this episode. I felt like I wanted to learn more and watch more, but that's a good place to be in for something that is, as you say, as complex as this is, and as high concept. But yeah. Yeah.
One other scene I want to talk about, because you mentioned it briefly, but I do want to zoom in on it a little bit because it is such a good fucking scene, is the Kiritsugu Kotomine scene. Like, their rivalry is a big part of the whole series, and so it's a really important relationship. Like, a lot of the Kotomine and Kiritsugu stuff specifically, and the Saber stuff, that is the main stuff that if you had played Fate Stay Night, you would know basically what that story is going to be, because that's a lot of the stuff that's explained. Like all the stuff with like Kaneth, he's never mentioned in Fate Stay Night. So a lot of like those other characters are ones that are invented for Fate Zero, but the Kiritsugu and Kotomine line, that is kind of like that main through line that is going to extend into a lot of the Fate Stay Night stuff. And so that scene that is setting up those 2 characters, they're both reading about each other, is so good. And everything about it is amazing because it tells you so much about like both these 2 people and then also like Tosaka in the world of the mages. One detail in that scene I adore is that Tosaka, you know, like Kotomine comes into Tosaka's like workshop or whatever, and he's got this ridiculous magical apparatus that's like this like quill pin on this like bone fucking arm thing that like is like writing down in like cursive or like magic runes or some shit a message from the clock tower, and it's like the most ridiculous magical fucking fax machine, and he's got that, and that's the report he has. And then later it cuts to Kiritsugu, and Kiritsugu's doing the same thing, but he just has a computer with a fucking fax machine, and that's it.
Yes.
And it like tells you so much the difference between these people, because you get Tosaka talking about how like Kiritsugu, this man, the mage slayer, he's someone who has like no respect or pride as a mage or for the world of magic. He's rogue, right? And he even seems to have like spite for it to a certain extent, because he went around for years killing all these mages. And I love, you immediately get that contrast where it's like he doesn't give a shit about what probably is some amazing, like, 500-year-old magical artifact thing that Tosaka has that like, transcribes these messages sent to him from the clock tower. And Kiritsugu just has a fucking fax machine. And I love that contrast so much.
Yes, that's one of my favorite things in this whole episode. That machine is so good. This episode does not have a lot of the like Ufotable CG integration, except that little fucking arm is all it has to be like a digital asset, and it's so fun. I love he also like takes this big knife to like cut the pieces of paper off. It's so extra. It's so extra. It tells you a lot about him. Yeah, no, I liked these characters a lot though, because one thing that's fun is Kodomine is Joji Nakata, who we mentioned in talking about Kara no Kyokai, because he voices the bad guy there. What's his name?
Soren.
Soren. But Soren is a major character in Kara no Kyokai, but you don't see him much. So like Joji Nakata is very good, but you know, it's that fucking wonderful deep booming voice he has. You only get a little bit of in Kara no Kyokai. And when I realized like Kodomine opened his mouth and talked to him, like, we're going to get a lot of Joji Nakata here. This is great, because I love that actor, and I love the it's also like when you look at Kodomine's character design, it's not exactly the voice you would expect. And so I like that kind of dissonance from it. It makes him like a extra kind of mysterious character to me. But all the voice acting here is great. And I'm actually looking through the cast right now, and there's characters we haven't heard talk yet. And I'm looking at them like, oh God, this cast is fantastic.
It's an incredibly stacked cast. Yeah. And it'll be true in Fate's Stay Night as well. Yeah. Kodomine Kide is, I don't think it's a spoiler to say, it's, you know, with the prequel thing, he is a character in Fate's Stay Night as well. He will be there also. And it is like one of Nagata Joji's like favorite roles. I follow him on Twitter, and he posts like pictures of him cosplaying as the character and stuff. He like when in like conventions and things like that, like he goes so ham with it. Like he clearly loves playing this character. And it's really interesting from my perspective, you know, as someone who comes from Fate's Stay Night and knows an older version of the character. It's really interesting to then see him play the character younger, because I think that's part of what he's doing with the voice also, is that it is not as sort of epic or something as he can go with his voice, which is more what you see with like Soren. And that's a little bit more in the Kodomine territory he gets in like older Kodomine. And here it's like he's getting there, but there's something not quite fully formed about the character yet that I think creates this dissonance you're sort of talking about with the voice and the character. That's like there's something unsettled about who he is yet. That is part of this story. But yes, Nagata Joji, one of my favorite actors, and this is my favorite role he has, and it's one of his favorite roles. And it's like it's just such a good performance. And it's always good to have your crazy evil priest dude or whatever, you know, like we learned that he was like an executor in the Catholic Church, which is someone who hunts heretics, which is basically the same thing that Kiritsugu did. And all that shit is just like, you know, you get some like the coolest pieces of throwaway dialogue that describes the shit that these characters did. You're like, the fuck is an executor of the Catholic Church and like a member of the Eighth Sacrament and all this like crazy shit you get.
Because this is basically contemporary, like the world, like this is set in the present day, roughly.
This would be 1994 because it's 10 years before Fate's Stay Night. But yeah, it's more or less contemporary Japan.
They have fax machines and stuff. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, so roughly our world. And I do love the idea that the Catholic Church, just in secret, just is really crazy today, like way more than we thought. They have executors, they have mages, they're all over the world. They're much more active in Japan than you'd assume. Yes. It's great. But yeah, Kirei, because Kodomine is such an interesting character here, because at the very beginning, you know, he's kind of like jumped into this, and he seems like he doesn't have much of a will of his own. I think over the course of the episode that gets complicated, because he and Kiritsugu are very much like put as opposites over the course of this hour. This is something that's, I think, very smart about the storytelling here, is they set them up as rivals without ever putting them in a room together, in part because that sequence where they're learning about each other is so well edited, and they're both learning, like, what from their perspective are kind of horrible, terrifying things about the other person, right? Like, oh, Kiritsugu was a mage assassin, which, by the way, in Japanese is such a good word. It's Majutsu Goroshi. Amazing phrasing, I just have to say. I love that word. Goroshi is such... Am I getting that right? Is that assassin?
Yeah, it's Majutsu Goroshi. Yeah, Majutsu is a mage, and then Goroshi is like Koroshi, like to kill. So yes, he's the mage slayer or whatever, yeah.
I just love that. It's a great terminology. Like, it's something that when Joji Nakata like wraps his mouth around that phrase, says it, is very fun. So you're learning, you know, he did all of these things, but then also Kodomine like came close to mastering every magic, but he never chose one, and he went to the next one. And it's like, I can't figure this dude out, and he's scary, and I love all of that.
Yeah, because it's like Kotomine seems to have no ambition, right? He like does a thing until he's almost close to mastering it, and then he just goes like moves on to the next thing. And he's like has been a part of like all these different organizations in the Catholic Church, and he's never stuck with one. And then on the flip side, you've got Kiritsugu, who spent before he went to got brought in by the Einsburns, he went around to these battlefields and was assassinating mages, but also was getting involved in these incredibly dangerous conflict zones for seemingly no reason whatsoever. And as Kotomine says, it's like clearly he was trying to achieve something. He wasn't just doing it for money. So what was he trying to achieve? And then what did he find when he got to the Einsburns that convinced him to stop and then participate in this Holy Grail war? Because clearly Kiritsugu is driven by some kind of incredible, overpowering passion that we don't yet know about. But that Kotomine clearly lacks. It's the exact opposite. Like he has no passion. Kiritsugu has this passion that seemed to have driven him to the point where he didn't care whether he lived or died because he was doing incredibly dangerous shit for seemingly no benefit.
That's the fun thing about this episode so far, or this series so far, is that every single character is mysterious. There's like, we don't understand any of them particularly well at the end of this first episode because we're so kind of jumped into the middle of this story. And usually for that kind of structure, you would have the everyman at the center who's kind of like someone you attach to as you're learning about all these mysterious characters. But that center isn't there in this one. And so far, at least through this first hour, it does really well with what is an unusual structure because of that. And I know in light novel form that makes sense because it's a prequel to something you would have been expected to already read. But as an anime, they're having to deal with this is probably new to most people watching it.
Yes.
And I think they do a good job with that.
Yeah, and it really embraces the ensemble nature of the story, which is fun because it fits the overall premise so well, right? Because the premise of the Holy Grail War, you have 7 masters who are going to battle. Fate's Day Night, by the nature of its structure, where you have this one POV character who's the main dude, is your kind of broadly audience surrogate character. Like by necessity, like it privileges a certain set of characters around the sphere of him more than other mages or other masters. That's part of the nature of having the 3 routes in Fate's Day Night, is that they have this larger ensemble. Each route gets to focus on a different subsection of them and be like, okay, we got to deal with the caster side of things really well in this story. That means in the next one, we don't need to bother with that so much. Let's deal with like the writer or whatever, that side of the world. Whereas for Fate Zero, it just gets to, I think, put broadly similar importance on every member of the ensemble cast. Obviously, the Kiritsugu Kotomine stuff feels slightly elevated, but generally speaking, it really embraces that whole ensemble structure, which, as a fan of the series, is always something I've loved, is that it gets a very different perspective on the nature of this Holy Grail War, that you're really looking at it more from that battle royale perspective, like who's going to win, how is it going to play out once you have this mix of all these crazy people thrown together in Fuyuki, Japan, fighting with magic, mystical fucking heroes from the past.
Well, it's already got me interested in that side of it, and we don't even know all the combatants yet, let alone we don't really know the summons and those characters yet at all, right? But I'm already like gaming out like, okay, dramatically, where are they going to go? You do, like, your first blush would be Kiritsugu seems like maybe the hero who they would give this to, but it's also a prequel where things are probably going to go bad, so who knows? And I'm just like, but then everyone else kind of seems like a dick, but you do have the guy who's like fighting to the death so he can save the little girl, and that's tragic, and yeah, so I'm already kind of trying to game that out, and it's fun, and you know, there's nothing better than an anime tournament arc, and essentially that seems like that's what this is, just in a weird fashion, so I'm excited.
Yes, I think that is like one of the distinct pleasures of Fate Zero specifically, is that it gets to enjoy that nature of the setup and get some of that tournament feel, more so than Fate's Day Night. That has the same setup but kind of goes in a different direction with it. So yes, nice. I think you're in the right mindset to appreciate some of what Fate Zero is going to do for you.
Excellent. Can we talk about the fucking evil family with the worms for a second?
Okay, yeah, the Matos. Yeah. I mean, it's... So... I guess I'll mention this just because I find it incredibly funny. So some of the Mato stuff that happens here is, it might feel weird when we get to Unlimited Blade Works, that it's not, none of that shit is going to come up in Unlimited Blade Works, because all of that is Heaven's Feel stuff. And I've always found it hilarious that, like, people wait years and years and years where there's this whole, because it's a big thing in Fate Zero, obviously, because Fate Zero is a prequel to the entirety of Fate Stay Night. That, like, a lot of, like, the stuff involving that family is really important, but it just doesn't come up in Unlimited Blade Works. So people who only watch the anime stuff, they had the scene with the little girl getting thrown into the fucking worm pit. That little girl, as with lots of child characters, appears in Fate Stay Night, and they never bring it up in Unlimited Blade Works, and I find it hilarious that people went years, if you didn't read the visual novel, being like, what the fuck was going on with the worm people? That's a huge thing in Fate Zero, and it never fucking comes up. Well, luckily for you, Jonathan, you won't have to wait years to get the movies or whatever. Like, you'll just be able to watch the movies and get the full payoff on the entire scope of that story. But yes, the worm people, the Matos, it is important. It's very important.
Yes. Because the little girl he's protecting, that's the Tosaka family, right? And
that's one of the two girls from the Tosaka families. You've got Rin, who has stayed with Tosaka, and then Sakura, who has been given to the Matos because they didn't have an heir.
And I know, just because this is I've seen her on key art, Rin Tosaka is a main character in Fate, right? Like,
yes.
Okay. Because I've seen her elsewhere. Iconic character design when you see her in this one as a little chibi version of her, but you know she grows up. So I know they're important, and her sister is being horribly abused. But yeah, so you've got, and I think that the character, I'm forgetting his name, who's the son of the Mato family.
Kadia.
Kadia, yeah, he's the one who comes in, and it seems like he has long since abandoned this family, but he's coming back and offering his body up to the parasite worms so he can save Sakura. And it's just because, and then by the end of the episode, you see like his skin is pulsating with the worms underneath, and his leg is fucked up, and he's missing an eye. And boy, poor guy, he's like starting the show, I feel like, at a severe disadvantage. I know they're not literally the ones fighting, but I think he's got an uphill battle here.
Yes, well, one of the other things we see, they haven't talked about it a lot, but also they have the scene at the end where Zoken messes with the summoning ritual, right? He tells him, like, put these 2 lines in as well, and you're going to summon a hero with the madness attribute, and that's the Berserker class. So yeah, like, Kadia's whole world is very fucked up because he's going to get the insane servant. That's the Berserker. Yeah, the worm shit's fucked up. One thing I do, because you mentioned earlier, I think you had a slight misconception about the worms. The worms don't specifically have anything to do with being chosen by the Holy Grail. That's not, like, interrupting that process. What it does do is that it gives you, it's one way to get, like, magical power, is using these, like, magical parasites called crest worms.
I think it's because they're called crest worms, and they have the thing on their hands, and that's what I was, like, confused about. So
yeah, so you have magical crests are one of the things that mages have in their body that allow them to use magic. Right. So that's where the term comes from. It doesn't have anything actually to do with the command spells, but I can see that misconception. So he's chosen by the Holy Grail mostly because he has a very powerful wish that he wants Sakura to be safe and, like, that family to be together again. He does have enough magical potential because of the crest worms now. And also I think his proximity to the Matos also probably makes him more likely to be chosen in the way that, like, Tosaka is likely to be chosen because it is one of the 3 families, right? Like, the Ainsburns are always going to have a master. The Tosakas are always going to have a master. The Matos are always going to have a master because they're one of the 3 families that created the ritual.
Right. I do think Zoken, the old man who wants immortality, maybe hasn't gamed this out all the way, because I do feel like if Kadia wins, and he can wish for anything, I don't know, I feel like he could create a scenario where Zoken is gone and not relevant anymore. I don't know if I would put my faith in someone I have tortured for that, but, teach their own.
I don't know if I would describe Zoken's attitude towards Kadia as faith. I'm not sure I would describe it as
faith's the wrong word, but okay.
This guy...
Yeah,
I think he's having. I think Zoken's being amused is how I would describe what's going on with Kadia.
All I'm saying is, if you kick him while he's down enough, and then you put him in proximity to the Holy Grail, there's a chance that doesn't end well for you. That's all.
Yeah. Zoken is a real fucking bastard. God, he comes in and he's like, he says it's like, oh, I'm impressed that you're still alive. Like, can you still use that left leg of yours? And he fucking stamps on it with his cane.
He's horrible. He's a total piece of shit. Yeah. One little question is, so I know in terms of the kind of Nasu verse, there are ideas shared, but they're not all in, like, the same continuity, right? Like, this does not exist in the world of Kara no Kyokai, but Kara no Kyokai and Witch on the Holy Night do coexist because of the Aozaki family, right?
broadly speaking, I mean, it's a thing where it's like it, because I think you can understand Kata no Kyokai and Fate as effectively existing in the same universe. It's just like there's never any notable crossover, right?
Okay.
Like it's and so if there are things that don't fully, I don't think they're like trying to be care about like, oh, this thing maybe contradicts what was mentioned in chapter 2 of Kata no Kyokai or something about the world building.
Okay.
If there's any like inconsistencies, it doesn't matter. That's kind of how I would characterize it. That's like they're clearly like the same kind of setting. Are they the exact same setting or like similar settings? Is like it doesn't really matter, I think.
Because it is just fun to see some of the same ideas, even in this the first episode, kind of like the clock tower, like one of the mansions they're in looks a lot like how the mansion is drawn in Witch on the Holy Night and stuff like that, where it's just fun to see some of these same ideas appearing in different forms in different places.
Yes, Tosaka even mentions, I think they translate it here as the source, which is frustrating because we're getting all these different terms for these same things.
But that's the root,
he mentions
right?
The root, right? Like the reason why he wants the Holy Grail is to reach the root. That is what the Tosaka family has always wanted. And so, like, you're getting a lot of the same shared concepts. Again, some of the counterforce stuff will come up again because that's connected to part of the nature of heroic spirits. So yes, you're going to get your mages and all that shit. And we get the thing that you get a taste of in movie 5 of Kata no Kyokai of just how fucking awful mage society is, and they're all fucking bastards. And yeah, you get so much of that stuff in Fate Zero, and I love it. I love how awful and like self-serving and egotistical the fucking mages are in this world.
It's good. Another notable crossover with Kata no Kyokai is we have Yuki Kajiura on the music again.
Yes.
It's outstanding right from the beginning. That's one of the most, like, I think, gripping things about this show in the first episode is the score is just, it slaps. It's great.
Yeah, it's so good. And especially someone who's rewatched it a couple of times, it stands out to me how many, like, there are lots of leitmotifs developed in this first episode that are used throughout the series. And it's something I picked up on watching it this time. Like, oh my God, yes, this is like, she's setting up like all the musical ideas that she will play with, or most of the musical ideas that she'll play with across the rest of the series. This episode in particular, I think is incredibly well scored. And then also speaking of the music, we do get at the very end of this episode, you get the opening animation with Oath Sign by Lisa, which is
I didn't know Lisa did this, yeah.
It is her first single, is Oath Sign. So
she also and UFO Table go back a long way.
Yes.
Wow. Okay,
yeah.
that's cool.
And yeah, her and UFO Table, and specifically her and Kazuyo Yuki, because Kazuyo Yuki has composed a lot of the music that Lisa has done, like notably like Homura and stuff like that. And a lot of because Lisa also has sung a lot of the music for the Sword Art Online series that Kazuyo Yuki also is the composer for, right? So there's a lot of like collaboration there. But Oath Sign is Lisa's first big single. It's kind of like the song that puts her on the map. We will hear more from Lisa. We'll also hear more from other artists that we know, like Calafina and Ame are going to be on here as well. So like the UFO Table musical cast of characters is going to be here present in Fate as well, which is going to be very fun to listen to.
It's awesome. This is kind of funny. Lisa was on my mind because I was on Netflix the other day scrolling, and she's got several concert films on Netflix. Mm-hmm. I didn't know were there. And I'm like saving these, like, these are things I will be watching over Christmas break. That sounds awesome. And then I saw her theme song here. And I'm like, this is small world. There's a lot of, if you watch enough UFO Table, you see the same people a lot. And it's great.
Yes, Oath Sign, it's a great opener. It's like, and it's just like so crazy looking back on it now and thinking like, oh my God, this is like the first big song that Lisa did. And now she's like one of the biggest J-pop artists, like J-pop / J-rock. Gorenge and Homura were like the biggest songs of the respective years that came out in Japan. So it's like, it's really crazy to go back to this and be like, this is where she came from.
Well, and here's another little fun tidbit. This is a little how the sausage is made, but you know the fine theme song that you guys are seeing at the beginning of Japanimation Station this season, same song we used last year that Thomas wrote, my brother. But I've redone the visuals, so it's all images from the shows we're watching this season. But so that I wouldn't spoil myself or anything, the way I edited that before we watched most of this because I didn't want to edit it at the end in a rush, right? So I used some footage from Kata no Kyokai, and then I pulled in the theme songs from all the Fate adaptations illustrations and a couple of little clip packages from Heaven's Feel. But I pulled out the first thing I did is I ripped out the audio because I didn't want to have preconceptions of how the audio synced with the images. And so I knew, I've looked at those images a million times while editing the theme song, so I know that, but I didn't know what the song was. And so it was actually very funny to be watching it with the song. I'm like, oh, this is a Lisa song. This is really good. I used the images in a completely different context, but this is kind of fun. So that's how I kind of put it all together, if you're wondering. But it's been a blast.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, all the opening and ending songs throughout all of Fate are like absolutely killer. So yeah, it's something to look forward to.
I'm definitely excited. So anything else we should say about the first episode of Fate Zero before we sign off for today?
I'm just like, I'm very happy that you're way into it. I mean, I assumed you would be after how much you liked Garden of Sinners, because obviously it is its own flavor. It is, in the similar box stylistically, and so I thought you would like it. But I'm very heartened that you're into it, because I think, obviously, it only gets better from here. It is a great show, and I mean, I rewatched it only a couple of years ago. I rewatched it, what it would have been like 2019, I think, because it was like a little bit after the pandemic started, I think I rewatched all the Fate stuff. I'm already super stoked. I watched that first episode. You said you watched it earlier today. I also watched it earlier today, and I was like, I had this thought process, like, I mean, there's no reason why I couldn't go on and keep watching the second or third or fourth episode right now. Like, I've already seen it before. It's not a big deal. But I was like, I should probably not. It maybe be distracting. I don't have that much time till the podcast. But I was like, immediately like, yeah, I'm into it. I'm gonna chew through this fucking show like candy, because it is so good.
I'm getting on a plane in about less than 12 hours. Well, no, a little more than 12 hours. But tomorrow early morning. And I have a long layover and then another flight, and I have downloaded like the whole first season onto my phone and my iPad over Crunchyroll. So I am ready to. This will keep me going through flights and airport stuff tomorrow, and I'm happy to have it.
Very good.
So it's great, and it's fun. It is a big change of pace too from Kara no Kyokai. Like there's crossover, but it's very different right off the bat, and I like that too. Just because it's fun to see other sides of this whole world. So it's excellent.
Very good. So again, we will be covering the rest of Fate Zero on the next episode. We're not stopping at season 1 or anything. So, the rest of the 24 episodes we'll all cover next time on Japanimation Station.
Japanimation Station.